"She's not a real doctor. We need someone qualified." That's what the flight attendant said as a man lay unconscious in first class, and the black woman standing over him, calm, composed, experienced, was ordered to step aside. Not because she lacked credentials, but because she didn't look the part. Before that moment, they'd moved her seat without warning, questioned her right to be there, ignored her requests, and treated her heritage as a customer like an error to be corrected. But this was the moment it stopped being subtle. This was the moment their prejudice nearly cost a man his life. What no one knew was that the woman they just dismissed was no ordinary passenger. And what's about to unfold will leave reputations shattered, contracts lost, and an entire industry forced to answer for what happened on that flight. Watch closely, because what started as quiet humiliation is about to erupt into one of the most powerful reversals of justice you've ever seen. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and which part hit hardest? Let's break this story down together. Tiana Brooks arrived at Gate 41 with 15 minutes to spare, perfectly on time, perfectly prepared, as always. Her heels made soft, confident taps on the polished tile, matching the rhythm of a woman used to walking into spaces that weren't built for her, but owning them anyway. She was dressed in a storm gray pantsuit tailored to precision, a silk blouse tucked neatly beneath, and her makeup was minimal, sharp, and intentional. She carried only 2 items: a slim leather briefcase and a worn caramel-colored travel bag with brass fastenings, the kind that looked like it had stories to tell. As she approached the first-class boarding lane, she noticed something subtle but undeniable. Each passenger ahead of her, mostly white, mostly male, had barely raised their phones before the gate attendant waved them through with a smile and a welcome aboard. But when Tiana stepped up and scanned her digital pass, the woman at the counter, young, red-haired, with a delta pin too large for her blazer, immediately changed her tone. "Can I scan that again, please?" Tiana offered a polite nod and held out her phone again. The scanner beeped. Green light. No issues. Still, the woman glanced at the screen, then back at Tiana's face. "Just a moment," she said, reaching for a secondary tablet behind her. Tiana raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the best way to expose subtle bias was not to react too quickly. The woman tapped the screen once, twice, squinted. "Okay," she said eventually, forcing a thin smile. "You're good to go." Tiana gave a curt nod and moved down the jet bridge, catching the brief flicker of a shared look between the gate agent and a colleague behind her. No words, just the kind of look she'd seen too many times before, the look that questioned her place, not based on a name or a number, but on everything else. As she stepped into the cabin, the cool filtered air met her skin, carrying with it the subtle scent of leather and citrus cleaner. First class was already half full. Businessmen on laptops, a couple sipping wine, a celebrity she vaguely recognized from some Netflix legal drama. She turned toward seat 1A, front row, window, spacious, hers. She was about to place her briefcase under the seat when a flight attendant approached from the galley. She was tall, composed, and her platinum blonde hair was pulled so tightly into a bun it looked sculpted. Her name tag read H. Madsen. "Good evening, ma'am," she said, with a tone that was polite in sound but flat in spirit. Her eyes flicked from Tiana to the bag in her hand. "Would you mind stepping back for just a moment? I need to verify something." "Is there an issue?" Tiana asked, her voice even. "I'm just making sure all carry-on items meet our cabin standards," Madsen replied, already leaning slightly toward the caramel-colored bag resting beside Tiana's seat. "That bag," she added, "might need to be checked. It doesn't quite match our typical carry-on profile for first class." Tiana stared at her for a moment, then slowly lifted the bag by its handle and placed it gently onto her lap. "This bag," she said calmly, "is within regulation size, weight, and content, and it was cleared at security without issue." Madsen didn't back down. "I understand, but sometimes appearances can be misleading. It just doesn't look like something we usually see in this section." Tiana's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Are you suggesting my bag doesn't belong here, or that I don't?" There was a beat of silence between them, thick and deliberate. "Of course not. Matson said, though her tone lacked conviction. "We just want to maintain a certain standard of presentation in our premium cabin." Tiana slowly unzipped the top of the bag, revealing neatly folded garments, a hardcover book, and a silk scarf embroidered with initials. "This was my grandmother's," she said flatly. "She carried it when she moved here in 1961. It's been to more countries than most of your passengers." Matson's posture stiffened. "Understood, ma'am. Please let me know if you need anything else." She walked away, but not before glancing back twice. Tiana placed the bag beneath the seat in front of her and exhaled. Not because she was tired, but because she was already counting the incidents. Gate double check, luggage comment, and she wasn't even airborne yet. She pulled out her tablet and stylus, opening the notes for the summit she'd just left behind. Notes filled with policy reforms, DI strategies, and leadership initiatives. Ironic, really. They'd given her a standing ovation just yesterday for a keynote titled Breaking Invisible Barriers. Yet here she was, 30,000 feet from equity, 10 feet from indignity. A man in 1B, seated beside her, gave a sidelong glance at the bag, then looked back at her. "Vintage?" he asked, trying to make small talk. "Heritage," Tiana replied without looking up. She didn't owe him softness. Not tonight. Across the aisle, a white woman in pearls leaned toward her husband and whispered something. He chuckled. Tiana caught the sound, not the words, but she didn't need to. She'd heard the shape of that laugh before. Tiana had barely begun to relax when a uniformed flight operations agent appeared at the front of the cabin, holding a small tablet and scanning the aisle with the expression of someone rehearsing authority. His name tag read, R. Porter, and though he wore the same Navy uniform as other ground staff, his stride and tone carried the clipped precision of someone used to giving orders and being obeyed. He stopped in front of a row, leaning in slightly as he tapped on his screen. "MS. Brooks?" he asked, his voice formal but tight. Tiana looked up, her brow arching with composed curiosity. "Yes," she replied. "There appears to be a maintenance note on your seat," he said, gesturing subtly toward 1A. "Specifically, the reclining mechanism isn't functioning properly. We're going to need to reseat you." Tiana remained still, her expression unreadable. "I just sat down. It seemed to be working fine." Porter gave a rehearsed smile. "We prefer to err on the side of comfort. There's an open seat we'd like to relocate you to, still in first class," he added quickly, as if that would ease the sting. Tiana hesitated, then nodded. "Fine," she said coolly, gathering her things without rushing. As she stepped into the aisle, she noticed that several other seats nearby were occupied, some by passengers who had boarded after her, none of whom had been asked to move. Porter led her a few rows back, stopping near the partition that separated first class from premium economy. "Here we are," he said, gesturing to a middle seat. Tiana stared at it. "This isn't first class," she stated flatly. "It's a transitional row," Porter said quickly. "Technically, still considered part of our premium section. More legroom than standard economy." "That's not what I purchased," Tiana said, her voice low but cutting. "I booked 1A, paid full fare. There was no indication of an issue until now." "There's a system-wide adjustment being implemented," he replied, sidestepping her words. "A few passengers were randomly reseated to balance weight distribution. Completely routine." Tiana blinked slowly. "Randomly," she echoed. "Yes, ma'am," Porter affirmed. "Algorithm-based. Nothing personal." Tiana didn't move. She pulled out her phone and tapped the Delta app, navigating to the seating chart. Her seat, 1A, was now listed as occupied. She refreshed. Still the same. Curious, she tapped several other names in the first-class manifest, checking who else had been moved. No changes. Everyone else was still in their assigned seats. Her seat had not just been reassigned, it had been reassigned to someone else. A white woman, now sipping champagne in 1A, who had boarded after her and was currently chatting animatedly with a nearby passenger, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Tiana looked up from her screen and leveled her gaze at Porter. "You said a few passengers were reseated." "That's correct," he said without blinking. "Name one, besides me." He paused, then faltered. I don't have access to all names right now. I assure you, don't. Tiana interrupted sharply. Don't assure-moi. Not when it's clear this decision wasn't random. Porter's smile thinned. Ma'am, I'm just following the procedures given to me. If you'd like to file a report, I will, Tiana said. But first, I'll need your full name and your supervisor's contact. Of course, he said, his voice tight. But I still need you to take your new seat so we can finish boarding. Tiana stood her ground for another moment, then slowly stepped into the transitional seat without another word. Around her, passengers were watching, some curious, some indifferent, some clearly aware of what had just happened but unwilling to speak. As she placed her briefcase under the seat and fastened her belt, her fingers moved with practiced precision. Her face was composed, but her mind was calculating. This wasn't the first time she'd been nudged out of place under the guise of procedure. It was never personal, they said. It was always protocol, always system error, always some benign administrative shuffle that conveniently displaced the black woman without raising a single alarm. She looked forward through the curtain, past the woman now sitting in 1A. That seat was no longer just about legroom or recline. It was about visibility, about worth, about who the airline quietly deemed deserving of front-row comfort and who they believed could be moved without consequence. But they had miscalculated, because Tiana didn't just have a phone. She had reach. She had audience. She had power in the form of testimony and platform. And above all, she had the patience to let this play out just long enough to collect every detail before exposing it. Tiana had barely adjusted to the narrow, downgraded seat she'd been pushed into when a voice barked from behind, cutting through the murmur of settling passengers like a blade. Excuse me, you're in the wrong seat. Startled but composed, she turned to see a balding man in his late 50s pointing at her with a crooked finger, his face already flushed with assumption. He wore a navy blazer with a pocket square that tried too hard and an attitude that tried even harder. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he continued loudly, eyes darting toward the front of the plane as if expecting backup. I'll get security if you don't move now. Tiana raised one eyebrow slowly, then tilted her head toward the seat number. I was assigned this seat, she said calmly, though her spine was straight with steel. It's printed on my boarding pass, which I'm happy to show you. The man squinted as if seeing her for the first time. Really? That seems unlikely. He let out a scoffing laugh and sank back into his own seat without apology, clearly expecting the surrounding passengers to nod along in agreement. No one did, but no one defended her either. The silence was louder than the accusation. Tiana turned back toward the aisle and exhaled slowly through her nose, a subtle release of pressure, not anger. Yet, 10 minutes later, as the last few passengers boarded and the crew made final preparations, another flight attendant approached her aisle. This one was younger, maybe early 30s, with a bright smile and a sing-song tone that suggested forced friendliness. Hi there, she said, beaming. I just wanted to welcome you aboard and introduce myself. I'm Erica. I'll be taking care of this section tonight. Tiana nodded politely. Thank you, she replied, keeping her response short. Erica's eyes dropped to Tiana's lap, where she was flipping through presentation slides on her tablet. Oh, you work in tech or something? She asked cheerfully. Actually, Tiana said, pausing on a slide about genomic data models. I'm a biomedical researcher. I head a translational research lab at UCSF. There was a pause. Erica blinked, then let out a light laugh that didn't sound quite genuine. Wow, that's impressive. Like hands-on lab stuff? Test tubes and microscopes. Tiana gave a tight smile. More like NIH grant submissions and computational modeling. Oh, Erica nodded, clearly trying to keep up. So, like a senior lab assistant or something? Tiana stared at her, letting the silence hang. No, she said plainly. I lead the team. I publish. I teach. Right? Erica said, her smile faltering just a fraction before bouncing back. Well, that's cool. I'll be around if you need anything. As Erica moved on, Tiana watched her walk away without looking back. Across the aisle, someone let out a stifled laugh, and Tiana didn't need to look to know it was the man from earlier. She returned her attention to her tablet, but the warmth was gone from her fingertips. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the ease with which they delivered it, the casual way in which she'd been reduced, minimized, flattened into a stereotype, and then brushed aside like lint on a lapel. And worse, it was familiar. Familiar like the way people pronounced her name with a question mark. Familiar like being asked in conference rooms whose assistant she was. Familiar like always having to decide whether to correct someone or let the ignorance slide for the sake of the moment. But she wasn't in the mood to let this one slide. She opened her notes app and began typing again, quietly documenting not just facts but tone, expression, language, Erica's exact phrasing, the laugh, the assumption. She knew how subtle prejudice could hide in plausibility, how easy it was for people to say, "Oh, that wasn't meant that way." But intent was irrelevant. Impact was real. And this one had landed. Around her, the cabin grew quieter as the final boarding announcement played. The door sealed with a soft mechanical hum. The plane pulled back from the gate. The lights dimmed. Tiana leaned back in her seat, forced to sit in the place they'd pushed her, but refusing to shrink inside it. She glanced down at the bracelet on her wrist, a thin silver band engraved with coordinates. Her grandmother's last home, her mother's birthplace, her own beginning. Every woman in her line had endured, and everyone had made sure that endurance meant something. She would not forget that here, even 30,000 feet in the air, surrounded by strangers who mistook her poise for pretension and her presence for a problem. The turbulence in Tiana's mind had barely settled when another ripple of insult made its way down the aisle, this time under the polished guise of guest comfort. The flight had been in the air just under an hour when a male flight attendant approached her row again, this one tall, brunette, and less practiced than the rest, his posture somewhere between deference and discomfort. "Excuse me, Ms. Brooks," he said gently, though the edge of his voice betrayed something rehearsed. "We've received a passenger request regarding seating." Tiana raised her eyes from her tablet, her expression already expectant. "What kind of request?" she asked, tone level. The man cleared his throat. "The gentleman in 6A, just across the aisle, he mentioned that he's feeling a bit anxious due to proximity, and asked if he could have some space." Tiana turned her head slightly, just enough to glimpse the so-called gentleman, a heavy-set white man in a pale gray sweater vest, who had done little all flight except sip bourbon and watch her out of the corner of his eye. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't sweating, wasn't showing a single sign of discomfort. But now suddenly he felt anxious. She returned her gaze to the attendant. "And your suggestion is?" He offered a weak smile. "We'd like to offer you another seat, just temporarily, of course. We're trying to maintain a comfortable environment for all our premium guests." Tiana didn't answer at first. She let the silence hang, made it heavy, made him sit in it. Then she asked, "Was anyone else asked to move?" The man hesitated. "No, ma'am." "So one person claims he's uncomfortable, and the solution is to relocate me?" "It's just, he's a platinum member, and we try to accommodate requests where possible." Tiana blinked slowly. "I'm sure you do," she said. "But I'm also a full-fare passenger in the seat I was assigned after already being relocated once." Her tone didn't rise, but it sharpened. "So unless this plane is breaking apart or that man is having a medical emergency, I suggest you tell him that his anxiety is not my responsibility." The attendant nodded quickly, a touch of embarrassment blooming on his face. "Understood, ma'am. Sorry to trouble you." He turned and left, and Tiana returned to her notes, jaw clenched, chest tight. She didn't look toward 6A again, but she felt his eyes. The pressure wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just the weight of being watched and measured, then moved like an unwanted item in the wrong section of a store. Dinner service began 20 minutes later. The cabin filled with the scent of roasted chicken and truffle butter, the rustle of menus being passed down, the clink of cutlery reset onto linen. But Tiana's tray remained folded. No one approached her. No one asked her preference. No one offered her a menu. She pressed the call button once, nothing. 10 minutes passed. She pressed it again. Still nothing. On the third try, the light above her blinked, then shut off on its own. She glanced around. Everyone else had already received their food. Even the couple who had boarded last minute were now on dessert. Tiana wasn't overlooked. She was being ignored. Deliberately. She knew the difference. Finally, she stood and walked toward the galley, stopping just outside the curtain. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough to be heard but soft enough not to alarm. A flight attendant she hadn't yet interacted with poked her head through. "Yes. I haven't been served," Tiana said. "Could someone let me know when meals are being distributed to my row?" The woman looked puzzled. "What's your seat number?" "6C, the woman blinked. "That can't be right. You're not on my list." Tiana narrowed her eyes. "Then your list is wrong." "It must be a system error," the attendant said quickly. "Let me get you something now." "No," Tiana said, her voice firm. "What I want is for you to go back and confirm why I was left off in the first place." "Ma'am, you heard me," Tiana interrupted. "I've already been moved once for someone else's comfort. I'm not going to be erased midair too." The attendant swallowed and disappeared into the back. Moments later, a different crew member returned with a full tray, her expression sheepish. "Sorry for the confusion," she mumbled. Tiana accepted the meal without thanks. She didn't owe gratitude for basic treatment. As she ate, slow and deliberate, she heard her name mispronounced over the intercom during the list of passengers with pre-selected meals. "Tina Brooks," someone said, then quickly moved on. No one corrected it. No one circled back. And when dessert came, they skipped her row again. This time, she didn't ask. She just watched. Watched the mechanics of selective invisibility operate in real time. How exclusion wasn't always about confrontation. It could be about omission. The ease of passing over someone without acknowledgement. The casual cruelty of pretending someone's presence didn't require service. Tiana folded her napkin neatly, placed it on the tray, and hit the call button one last time. Not for food, but for principle. When the light blinked and no one came, she opened her tablet again and added a new note in bold. Phase 3. Psychological pressure. Isolation by omission. Undermining presence through withdrawal of courtesy. Then she closed the app, leaned back, and smiled, not because she was content, but because she was collecting everything. And when the time came, none of this would be wasted. Tiana remained in her seat, calm on the surface, but slowly hollowing beneath it. The weight of microaggressions compounding into something colder, heavier, more calculated. After being ignored during the meal service and subtly erased from the standard passenger experience, she kept her movements minimal, conserving energy while quietly observing the patterns of dismissal around her. The air in the cabin had taken on a different density, one where silence wasn't peace but pressure, and every glance held a quiet vote on who belonged and who didn't. A few minutes after trays were cleared, the man in the aisle seat beside her unfolded a large newspaper with the flair of someone used to commanding space. The crisp snap of the pages drew her eye briefly, but what caught her attention fully was the headline now directly in her line of vision. First class no longer what it used to be, time to rethink passenger standards. The letters were bold, unapologetic, and unmistakably aimed at people like her, without saying it outright. She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't respond, but her eyes scanned the article's first few lines and caught phrases like lowered expectations, frequent abusers of reward systems, and diminished ambience due to lax screening. The man held the paper high, practically blocking her entire view forward, and though she could have asked him to adjust it, she didn't bother. The point wasn't coverage. The point was message. He wanted her to read it. So she did, and then she logged it. Her fingers tapped across her tablet, recording the headline and the timestamp, cross-referencing it against the man's seat number. He was methodical. So was she. Half an hour passed in tense quiet before the next moment chipped deeper into the days-long erosion. A family seated across the aisle was managing 2 young children, both restless but not unruly. The youngest, a curly-haired boy of about 6, was sipping orange juice through a paper straw when he suddenly jerked his arm and spilled the entire cup across the aisle. The stream hit Tiana's ankle and soaked the hem of her slacks with sticky citrus. The boy gasped, the mother looked up wide-eyed, and then leaned over the seat. "I'm so sorry," she said hurriedly. her voice tinged with embarrassment but not urgency. Tiana nodded politely, brushing off her leg with the edge of a napkin from her tray. Before the mother could act, a flight attendant swept in from the galley. Erica again, eyes scanning the mess. Without hesitation, she turned to the mother and handed her a thick white towel. "Here you go, ma'am," she said sweetly. "Let me know if you need more." The mother took the towel with a grateful nod, already blotting the seat. Tiana held out her hand, not aggressively, but plainly. "Could I get one too?" Erica's eyes flicked to her, then to the wet fabric on her pants. "Oh," she said after a beat, "do you have a personal towel or napkin on hand?" Tiana's face stayed neutral. "No. I assumed cabin service would include that." Erica hesitated, then shrugged as if to say there was nothing else she could do. "We're short right now, but I'll see what I can find." She turned and walked away. She never came back. Tiana sat in silence, the scent of orange juice clinging to the fabric as it dried. Around her, passengers returned to reading, watching, sipping drinks. The boy who'd spilled the juice peeked at her over the seatback, curious but unaware of the imbalance his mistake had triggered. His mother never looked back. It wasn't the juice that mattered. It was the response, the delay, the question, the assumption. It was the idea that Tiana would be better equipped to clean herself up because someone else was more deserving of assistance. It was the invisible algorithm that told Erica whose comfort was a priority and whose was optional. And more than anything, it was the exhausting predictability of it all. Tiana reached for her phone, opened the notes she'd already compiled, and began to draft a new section. Post-service biased behaviors. Nonverbal dismissal patterns. Response lag tied to passenger profile. Her fingertips moved with the rhythm of someone building not just documentation, but a case. Minutes later, the cabin lights dimmed further in preparation for rest. Pillows and blankets were handed out row by row. Erica and another attendant passed them carefully to each seat, except Tiana's. She watched as Erica walked by her row with 2 blankets folded in her arms and handed them off to the rows ahead and behind, bypassing hers without breaking stride. It was no longer an oversight. It was choreography, and the intent was clear, erased by exclusion. Tiana sat upright, refusing to reach for the button again. The chill in the cabin was minor compared to the chill of being purposely ignored. By now, she had stopped expecting decency from the crew. But what she had not stopped doing was remembering, recording, preparing. Every gesture, every word, every silence was a line in a much larger story. And while they thought they were freezing her out, they didn't realize she was setting the temperature of the storm to come. The quiet contempt that had cloaked Tiana for most of the flight was finally pierced, not by kindness, but by crisis. Somewhere in the front row, a sharp gasp rang out, followed by the distinct clatter of a glass hitting the floor. Passengers craned their necks, and murmurs began to stir. A man, elderly, maybe mid-70s, had slumped in his seat, his skin pale, his mouth slack. The woman beside him shrieked, "He's not breathing right," before standing up and waving her hands frantically. Tiana immediately rose from her seat, instinct overriding fatigue, training cutting through frustration. She stepped into the aisle and moved forward with purpose. "I'm certified for in-flight emergency response," she said clearly, making her way past the row. "I'm FAA licensed and currently head of clinical simulation at UCSF." Before she could reach the passenger, a flight attendant, one she hadn't seen all flight, stepped in front of her, arms spread like a barrier. "Thank you, but please return to your seat," he said briskly, not even making eye contact. "We need a professional to handle this." Tiana blinked. "I am a professional," she replied, her tone steady. "I've handled more than 50 in-air medical incidents and trained hundreds of paramedics in crisis protocol." "We understand, but our crew is trained for these situations," he said, then turned toward another flight attendant without waiting for her response. Tiana remained frozen in place as the woman next to the fainted man shouted again, "Somebody help him," yet no one stepped forward. Tiana clenched her fists, inhaled slowly, and began backing away, not because she wasn't capable, but because she had just been publicly deemed unqualified without consideration, without verification, without dignity. 2 full minutes passed as the commotion grew louder. A whisper moved down the cabin. "Is there a doctor?" The same attendant now grabbed the intercom and asked if there is a licensed medical doctor on board. "Please press your call button immediately." The words echoed down the rows. Tiana looked around. Silence. She raised her hand calmly. "I already said I'm qualified." Another attendant, Erica again, now visibly flustered, walked toward her with narrowed eyes. "Are you a physician?" she asked flatly. "I'm a trauma-certified Ph.D. in biomedical emergency care with FAA flight emergency clearance," Tiana replied, her voice cool but not wavering. "I hold 2 advanced certifications in airborne medical intervention. I train residents." Erica paused, clearly processing none of it. "So you're not an MD?" "Correct," Tiana said, "but then we'll wait." Erica cut her off. "Unless there's a doctor." She turned away, already dismissing the expertise that had been offered. Moments later, a man from business class, tall, bald, and perhaps in his 40s, stepped forward and quietly offered, "I'm a general practitioner." The attendants swarmed him instantly. Tiana watched as he approached the patient and began asking rudimentary questions. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the pulse. His voice was unsure. It took 30 seconds for her to realize he hadn't done this before, not under pressure, not at 30,000 feet. She looked on in silence, refusing to humiliate him. But her chest burned, not with ego, but with the knowledge that someone's life was now more at risk, because a woman like her was never what they pictured when they heard the word expert. A few minutes passed. The older man began breathing normally again, thanks more to oxygen and time than intervention. The tension in the cabin settled into embarrassed silence. Erica passed back down the aisle and paused by Tiana's row. "Thank you for offering," she said tightly, "but protocol does not include insulting licensed responders mid-flight." Tiana cut in. "It doesn't include letting personal bias trump competence." Erica didn't reply. She walked off. The other passengers watched quietly now, their expressions unreadable, their earlier snickers and sidelong glances replaced by awkward silence. No one spoke. No one apologized. But the damage was done. Tiana returned to her seat and picked up her tablet again, though her fingers shook slightly. She wasn't angry because they doubted her credentials. She was furious because it had put a vulnerable person at greater risk. She didn't need a spotlight. She didn't need applause. She needed them to stop assuming she was invisible unless she failed. She wrote a new section in her notes: "Incompetence preferred over unexpected expertise. Safety sacrificed for appearance of control." The ink of her thoughts was sharp now. Precision replaced exhaustion. The system they trusted so much had just failed them because it refused to trust her. The humiliation of being deemed unqualified to help save a life had crystallized something in her, a decision not to merely endure, but to act. She reached calmly into her coat pocket and tapped her smartwatch, 1 long press, then 3 short, rhythmic taps. A secure protocol embedded months ago, hidden behind layers of security, now activated without a single visible ripple. On the surface, it looked like a fidgeting gesture, maybe a stretch of the wrist. But in the airwaves above, a silent code had just traveled to a control system beyond the cockpit, a signal that could only be sent by someone holding an active Federal Aviation Investigation credential. Few people in the world carried that clearance. Tiana Brooks was one of them. As the seconds ticked by, she resumed typing on her tablet, quietly noting the full chronology of what had happened so far. The seat reassignment, the meal neglect, the erasure, the denial of medical expertise. Her notes were organized with the meticulous precision of someone who was not simply logging complaints, but gathering evidence. Then came the shift. 5 minutes later, the cabin lights flickered subtly, followed by the low murmur of cockpit static over the intercom. A few passengers looked up, puzzled. Tiana didn't move. Then footsteps approached, not hurried, but deliberate. The curtain to the front cabin parted, and a man in a Navy pilot uniform with silver stripes and wings stepped out. He was in his late 50s, tall, grave, with the poise of someone who had faced turbulence that didn't show on radar. He stopped directly in front of Tiana's row and said, without preamble, "Ms. Brooks." His voice was even, but something in his posture had shifted. It carried the weight of protocol. Tiana looked up and nodded. "Captain." He gave a formal nod back. "We received your signal. I've confirmed your credentials. Would you like to proceed with inspection now or upon landing?" The surrounding passengers froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. The man with the newspaper lowered it with both hands trembling slightly. The mother of the orange juice kid stared, mouth parted. Erica, the flight attendant, who had just passed Tiana's row with a tray of tea, dropped her voice to a whisper. "Inspection?" The pilot turned toward her. "This flight is now under observational review by the Office of Civil Air Compliance. We are to maintain operational transparency and cooperate fully. Ms. Brooks holds oversight clearance under federal aviation law." Erica blinked, visibly paling. You didn't ask," Tiana said, rising slowly, brushing the front of her blazer smooth. "But I've been watching everything." At the rear of the first-class cabin, a young man holding his phone to record had been quietly live-streaming the earlier argument during the medical emergency. His channel, one of those popular reaction commentary pages, had picked up steam over the past few months. He hadn't expected this. "Whoa," he whispered to his seatmate. "People are asking who she is in the comments." Then came a voice through his earbuds, his cousin, watching the stream from Atlanta, yelling over speaker, "Dude, that's Dr. Tiana Brooks. The one who pulled 5 passengers out of that Gulfstream crash 2 years ago. She got the President's Medal of Freedom. How do you not know her face?" The live stream exploded. Hearts and comments flooded the screen. "That's her? She saved my niece. I just watched her TED Talk last week." The video was already being clipped, re-uploaded, shared. Back on the plane, Tiana remained collected. She didn't revel in the silence that had fallen across the aisle. She didn't smirk when the man in 6A shrank into a seat, nor when Erica began to visibly tremble. She simply looked at the captain and said, "We'll begin documentation upon landing. In the meantime, I'd like you to inform your crew that I'll be monitoring every interaction from this point forward." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, without hesitation. "We'll comply." The word "ma'am" landed like thunder. Not condescension. Respect. Her smartwatch vibrated lightly on her wrist, a small notification lighting up the screen. She glanced down. A push message from the SkyPrime Airport Service System flashed in bold letters. "Thank you, Dr. Tiana Brooks, Platinum Medical Liaison Member. 7 years of emergency flight response service." It was automated, routine even, sent to all verified airborne specialists once their credentials were cross-checked during a live emergency. But today, in this context, it became something else. A digital echo of truth sent into a cabin full of people who had, up until minutes ago, questioned her value, her presence, her right to exist at their level. She didn't need to raise the screen or show anyone. One of the passengers, a teenage girl seated diagonally across the aisle, caught the message from the glow. Her mouth dropped slightly, her eyes wide. She nudged the man next to her and whispered, "That's real. She's registered. Like federal-level real." The man nodded silently. The evidence was now undeniable, embedded in a network none of them could manipulate. Then, just as the whispers were dying down, a voice rose, not loud, not theatrical, but clear, reverent, and familiar in the tone students reserve for people who have shaped their path. "Excuse me," the voice said, rising from the third row. A young man, tall, lean, with thick black glasses and a white hoodie bearing the Johns Hopkins crest, stood up slowly. He looked at Tiana with growing recognition. "I know you," he said with a gentle smile that betrayed both awe and affection. "You're Dr. Brooks. You were my trauma module lead last spring. You taught the Advanced Rapid Response course." Tiana turned to face him, her expression softening for the first time in hours. "You passed with distinction," she replied. "You made the top of the peer review board." The young man nodded, eyes glistening slightly. "When I had that motorcycle accident last summer, your training saved my life. The EMT said if I hadn't done what I did, I wouldn't have made it to the hospital. You were the reason I knew what to do." A collective hush fell over the cabin. His voice wasn't theatrical, but it rang louder than any announcement. "I don't know what happened earlier," he continued, looking around now, "but if anyone here doubted who she is or what she's capable of, let me be clear. She is one of the most qualified emergency experts in the country. If anything happens to anyone on this plane, we'll be lucky she's here." No one moved. No one objected. Even Erica, now stationed silently at the front galley, looked frozen, her mouth a faint line of discomfort. The man in 6A, who had earlier felt anxious, now shrank visibly into his seat, his posture that of someone wishing to disappear. Tiana offered the student a small nod, and he returned to his seat quietly, not seeking applause, just truth. From the back of the cabin, a couple passengers began murmuring, not with judgment now, but with guilt. "I had no idea," one whispered. "She's that Dr. Brooks," someone else muttered. A third leaned across to say, "I watched her panel during the 2022 Emergency Health Summit. She's the one who pioneered the non-contact triage protocol." Tiana heard all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct or explain. She let the voices carry themselves, let the truth bounce from row to row like a wave reversing the tide of earlier judgment. The pilot returned once more, this time accompanied by a flight supervisor who had boarded from the jump seat during refuel. "Dr. Brooks," he said respectfully, "just to confirm, would you like to initiate real-time compliance audit documentation?" "Yes," she said, rising to accept the provided tablet. "Effective immediately. I'll begin with seat reassignment records and service logs." "Of course," the supervisor said. Full transparency granted. As she moved forward, the digital tablet in her hands unlocked with biometric clearance, and the cabin watched a woman they had diminished now command the infrastructure they believed in most. Not with rage, not with revenge, with readiness. The final hour of the flight unfolded in an eerie stillness, not from calm, but from recognition. Every whisper, every stolen glance now carried weight, not of judgment toward Tiana, but toward themselves. No one offered apologies aloud, yet their silences grew louder with guilt. The student's voice, the captain's respect, and the flood of recognition had altered the atmosphere of the cabin into something resembling reverence. Tiana remained professional, methodical, and composed, sitting in her restored seat, tapping through data logs and cabin interactions via the flight supervisor's device. She submitted timestamps, photographic evidence, verbal transcripts she had memorized and recorded, all while sipping a glass of water that had finally been offered, this time without her needing to ask. As the plane began its descent, the usual polite announcements about landing were joined by something new. A coded message sent via internal intercom, alerting ground operations that a federal compliance officer was on board and active. The crew knew what that meant. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. As the wheels touched down with a soft groan against the tarmac, a line of vehicles stood waiting beyond the gate. 2 government SUVs with Department of Transportation plates, 1 sedan marked with the seal of the Office of Civil Rights and Aviation, and a black unmarked van carrying FAA internal compliance officers. The passengers saw them through the windows. Some gasped. Others grew visibly pale. But Tiana remained still, unbothered, until the door was opened and the cabin crew was asked to remain on board until further instruction. 2 agents boarded immediately, 1 male, 1 female, both in dark suits with clipped radios at their hips and federal badges around their necks. They didn't ask for Tiana. They knew exactly where she sat. One leaned forward and offered a quiet nod. "Dr. Brooks, your report has been escalated. We're here to begin phase 1 of the on-ground review. Would you like to debrief first or proceed directly to crew interviews?" Tiana stood and said, "I'll start with the manifest. Pull all employee interaction data for the last 8 hours." "Already in motion," the woman agent replied. "Legal is monitoring live from DC." The murmurs among passengers became hushed chaos. Cameras emerged. Someone whispered, "Is this a raid?" Another said, "She called the feds on them mid-flight." No one dared question her presence now, not even the man with the newspaper, who had turned his head to the window and refused to look back. By the time the jet bridge extended and the plane began to empty under federal observation, 2 reporters from a national network had already gathered near the arrival area with cameras rolling. Someone had leaked the live stream from earlier, and the story was spreading like wildfire. Headlines began populating across devices. Flight crew rejects help from hero doctor. Turns out she's a federal aviation investigator. $2 million medical contract in jeopardy after airline humiliates national medal recipient. Passengers speak out after witnessing racial profiling on Flight 386. At baggage claim, Tiana stepped off the escalator with quiet grace, flanked by agents but never handcuffed, never questioned, only followed like a CEO in transit. Reporters called her name, asking if she had a statement. She paused just once, turned to one camera, and said, "Accountability isn't an attack. It's a mirror." Then she walked on. Within 48 hours, Skylux Airlines was served a formal inquiry and placed under temporary operational review for civil rights violations, service conduct, and compliance breach. But the worst came 2 days later when the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services terminated its $2 million contract with Skylux, a 7-year agreement to provide priority executive medical transport for federal operations. In its official statement, the department cited ethical misalignment and failure to recognize credentialed personnel based on observable bias. It made national headlines. Stocks dipped. The board held an emergency press conference. But the public had seen enough. They had seen the live stream. They had heard the student. They had watched the plane land not just with passengers, but with proof. While Skylux Airlines scrambled to contain the PR disaster, reshuffling their executive board and issuing generic apologies, change began to take root in smaller, quieter ways. One of the first letters to arrive at Tiana's office came in a cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed with no return stamp. Inside was a simple piece of stationery and a folded certification application. The letter read, "Dear Dr. Brooks, my name is Erica Lowell. I was one of the flight attendants on Flight 386, the one who ignored you, the one who judged you before I even listened. I don't expect you to remember my face, but I remember yours. I remember the calm you carried even when we failed you at every turn. I remember the way you didn't fight back with rage, but with facts, with restraint, with clarity. When I saw your face on the news and realized who you were, I felt ashamed. Not because I got caught, but because I finally understood that I had been trained to see authority in one shape only, and I never stopped to question it. I thought I was protecting the standard of first-class service. I realize now that what I was protecting wasn't standard, it was exclusion. I've submitted my resignation. I'm re-enrolling in a health science program. I want to work on the ground this time to understand what service really means. If you ever speak publicly again, I'd like to sit in the front row, not as staff, but as a student. With respect, Erica." Tiana folded the letter slowly and placed it in a small wooden box on her shelf labeled "Kept." She didn't need to display it. She only needed to remember that change was not always loud, but sometimes deeply real. The second message came digitally, an email that filtered through her foundation's volunteer intake portal, flagged by a staffer for its subject line, "Application from Flight 386." The sender was Marcus Green, the same man who had sat across the aisle with a loud newspaper and louder assumptions. The message was brief but unflinching. "Dr. Brooks, I owe you a direct acknowledgement. I was the man who used his newspaper like a wall, who made you feel smaller because I thought your presence disrupted the image I had of where I belonged. You didn't say a word to me, but everything about your composure made me question my behavior. I watched the entire event unfold, from the moment you stepped on that plane to the moment federal agents arrived. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I had told my son earlier that week that kindness matters more than appearance. I failed him. I failed myself. And I disrespected you. That ends now. I'm applying to volunteer at your organization. Not because I want to prove I've changed, but because I need to. I want to help build a space where my son sees people like you not just being included, but being in charge. Sincerely, Marcus." By the end of that month, Tiana's nonprofit received over 400 new volunteers, 50 new donors, and 2 anonymous contributions earmarked specifically for aviation bias training modules. She didn't go on a media tour. She didn't write a memoir. Instead, she approved the pilot launch of a new educational partnership between her institute and 4 major U.S. airlines focused on re-educating cabin crews, redefining professionalism, and re-establishing what leadership actually looks like at 35,000 feet. But the greatest shift didn't come from letters or headlines. It came one quiet morning in her office when her assistant knocked gently and said, "There's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he won't stay long." Tiana looked up, nodded. When the door opened, a boy no older than 10 stepped in, accompanied by his mother. He held something behind his back, a folded sheet of paper. "Dr. Brooks," he said softly, "my juice spilled on you." Tiana's expression didn't change. "I remember," she said. The boy stepped forward, handed her the paper. It was a hand-drawn picture of a plane and a woman in a navy suit with curly hair and a smile, standing tall among passengers. "I told my teacher about you," he said. "She said you're a role model, so I drew you saving the plane." His mother wiped her eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Tiana knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad you saw me." And for the first time in a long time, she felt completely seen. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. What part hit you the hardest? Was it the moment of silence in the cabin, the reveal of Tiana's true identity, or the quiet apology at the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which moment stood out most to you. And let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters here.